Tonight, we're diving into a story that's shaking the political conversation across America. A brand new AP NORC poll shows that more and more Americans believe Israel has gone too far in its military response in Gaza. And here's the part that may surprise you. It's not just Democrats or independents raising concerns. Even some Republicans, who traditionally show strong support for Israel, are beginning to say, enough is enough. This shift is happening at the very moment when Gaza is facing a catastrophic humanitarian crisis, and the world is watching Israel with increased scrutiny. So what does this mean for U.S. politics, for President Trump's administration, and for America's role in the Middle East? Let's break it all down. As the conflict drags on, the numbers tell a very different story than they did just months ago. Back in November 2023, only about 40% of Americans said Israel's military action had gone too far. Fast forward to today, and that number has jumped to about half of all U.S. adults. That's a major shift in public opinion in less than a year. What's fueling this? The images and reports coming out of Gaza are difficult to ignore. Tens of thousands dead, neighborhoods leveled, families torn apart, and warnings of famine spreading across the region. For many Americans, regardless of political affiliation, the suffering of innocent civilians has become the defining issue of this conflict. And here's where it gets interesting. While Democrats are the most critical, with nearly 7 in 10 now saying Israel's response has gone too far, independents and even some Republicans are joining in. About half of independents now share that view, compared to just 4 in 10 last year. And among Republicans, the percentage has crept up as well, from 18% to 24%. It's not a massive change, but it's enough to show that frustration is growing across the political spectrum. Americans are no longer looking at this conflict in the same way they did when it first began, after Hamas launched its deadly attack on Israel in October of 2023. But here's the twist. While more Americans believe Israel has overstepped, fewer people now say that negotiating a ceasefire should be the U.S. government's top priority. Back in March, nearly 6 in 10 Americans said a ceasefire was extremely or very important. Today, that number has slipped to about half, and this decline is driven largely by Republicans, many of whom say the U.S. should back Israel's military campaign rather than push for peace talks. That leaves the Biden administration, and whoever is next in line, facing a very complicated public opinion landscape. Americans want humanitarian aid for Palestinians. They want Israel to show restraint, but they're not as eager as before to see the U.S. step in as peace broker. Now think about that for a moment. On one hand, the poll shows that Americans are horrified by the humanitarian disaster. On the other hand, they're less enthusiastic about pushing for a political solution. It's almost like the country is stuck in a paradox, deeply concerned about suffering, but skeptical that negotiations will actually solve anything. And when you ask people why, the answers are telling. Many say they don't trust either side to make peace last. Others point to the Trump administration's difficulties in brokering deals in the Middle East and Ukraine as proof that diplomatic promises often fail. That skepticism is fueling a kind of resignation among Americans. They don't want endless war, but they also don't see a clear path to peace. And here's where the stakes rise. Israel has now launched an expanded ground offensive in Gaza City, drawing even more criticism from human rights organizations and international leaders. A UN-commissioned panel has gone so far as to accuse Israel of committing genocide, a word that carries enormous legal and moral weight. The UN General Assembly also voted overwhelmingly to support a two-state solution, urging Israel to commit to Palestinian statehood. Yet Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected that call outright, doubling down on the war until Hamas is destroyed and all hostages are released. Meanwhile, the U.S. was one of the few nations to vote against that resolution, placing itself increasingly at odds with international sentiment. So what do Americans think about all of this? The poll found that while support for Israel's military remains, it's slipping. Only about 2 in 10 adults now say it's very important for the U.S. to provide military aid to Israel, down significantly from the start of the war. That drop is especially sharp among Democrats, falling from 30% to, for many, the idea of sending billions of taxpayer dollars overseas while Americans struggle with healthcare costs, inflation, and budget cuts simply doesn't add up. One independent voter in Georgia summed it up. If the government is telling us to cut spending at home, then why are we pouring money into someone else's war? That sentiment is catching on. At the same time, humanitarian relief for Palestinians is gaining ground. Nearly half of U.S. adults now say it's extremely or very important for America to provide aid to civilians in Gaza. People may be divided on ceasefire negotiations or military aid, but when it comes to helping families in desperate need, there's more common ground. Even Republicans who support Israel's military campaign told pollsters they want to see humanitarian assistance continue. That's an important shift because it means compassion is becoming a bigger part of the conversation, even among those who favor a strong stance against Hamas. But the big question remains, where does this leave U.S. policy? President Trump has pledged to end the war quickly if re-elected, but so far, that promise hasn't materialized. Approval of his handling of the conflict has slipped from 44% earlier this year to just 37% now. For Democrats, the situation is equally tricky. While their base is increasingly critical of Israel, Democratic leaders have traditionally aligned with pro-Israel policies. That tension is setting up a political storm heading into the next election cycle. And here's something else to keep in mind. For decades, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has revolved around unwavering support for Israel. But this poll suggests that the ground is shifting. Younger Americans, especially, are far more likely to question Israel's actions and call for Palestinian rights. As this generational divide grows, future administrations may find themselves forced to rethink long-standing alliances. What seems unshakable today could be very different 10 years from now. Now imagine the ripple effects. If U.S. support for Israel softens even slightly, it changes the balance of power in the region. It emboldens critics of Israel worldwide. It pressures Netanyahu domestically, and it forces Hamas and other groups to rethink their strategies. It could also impact America's relationships with Arab nations, many of whom have long demanded a two-state solution. In other words, this isn't just about polling numbers. It's about the future of U.S. foreign policy. And here's the final point. Americans are tired. They've seen endless wars in the Middle East, from Iraq to Afghanistan and now Gaza. They've watched billions of dollars spent overseas while domestic challenges mount at home. That exhaustion is shaping how people view this conflict. They want suffering to end, but they're not convinced the U.S. can fix it. They want peace, but they don't believe either side is ready to embrace it. And that's why this poll matters so much. It's not just a snapshot of opinion. It's a window into America's growing uncertainty about its role in the world. So as Israel pushes forward, as Gaza suffers, and as the U.S. struggles to decide what part to play, one thing is clear. Public opinion is changing. And when public opinion changes, policy eventually follows. The only question is how long it will take and how much more suffering will happen before it does.